Today we are talking with Bryan Denson, the author of Spire Son, the true story of the highest-ranking CIA officer ever convicted of espionage and the son he trained to spy for Russia. Welcome to Redera.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. And tell us what the book is all about.
Well, the elevator version is pretty well encapsulated in that rather long subtitle. It is the true story of the highest-ranking CIA officer ever to betray his country by selling secrets to the Russian Federation for $300,000 in cash over a period of about 2 years. And later he is arrested, convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage, and sentenced to 23 and a half years in the federal prison in Sheridan, Oregon, not too far from where I live, about 50 miles from where I sit at this moment. And there, in approximately July of 2006, after making some attempts to reach out to the Russians in the past, he recruited his own son, a 24-year-old fellow named Nathaniel, or Nathan Nicholson. And Nathan ultimately would travel around the world carrying messages to Russian spies on behalf of his father, and getting a glimpse into the rather romantic but ultimately fatal world of criminal espionage.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Intelligence business, and especially the international espionage, is never easy but yet very fascinating. What kind of people make good spies? Good spy is a very broad term and subjective term, but who passes the muster at CIA, and what kind of background checks are done, and why Jim somehow passed through?
Jim was ideal for what they were looking for. He was charming, which is almost a prerequisite. Very easy had a terrific facility for language, not just the English language and colloquial expressions and all those things, but spoke Tagalog, and I think had some experience in other languages as well. He was studying Russian from prison when he was arrested the second time. But Jim was not just charming, he was also highly intelligent, and by all accounts had come off as a real patriot. He was a guy who had been in the Army, had studied intelligence, and had gone through ROTC training in college on a 4-year scholarship. He was a guy with a lot of outward appearance of being a true patriot, doing the dirty work of the United States to keep America safe. At the same time, he was a very complicated guy who ultimately got into some marital problems that created what they call vulnerabilities, and that's something that the CIA is also very careful about. If you get divorced, or if you have a gambling problem or an alcohol problem, you might have loose lips. And Jim was going through a terrible divorce and a custody battle with his kids when he ultimately signed on and was what they call a walk-in. He was a volunteer spy for the Russian Federation while in Kuala Lumpur. But I will tell you, Jim's a very complicated guy, and was, right up until the time of he fell under investigation, Jim was known as what they call in the CIA a blue flamer. He was a guy who was really on the rise. He had been a station chief in Bucharest just before the fall of the Soviet Union, and that's a very coveted position in a very cool part of the world at a pivotal time in the global landscape. And so he was a trusted spy, talented spy by all accounts, and it's that kind of intelligence, charm, and someone who can talk people into things that makes for a good case officer in the CIA.
What led him to betray his nation? Were there any catalysts, or were there any reasons? Monetary, of course, would be one attraction, but there were not large sums or even significant sums of money involved in this transaction. What kind of led him away from the nation that he was entrusted to defend or protect?
Well, Jim had begun to feel that the CIA and the U.S. government had betrayed him. I think this was a partial motivation. I do believe that money was his primary motivation. He needed, when he volunteered his services to the Russian Federation, what the Foreign Intelligence Services, the Sluzhba Внешней Разведки, or the SVR as we call it, when he walked in, he was very specific. It was an authorized meeting with the CIA. The CIA thought he was going to be talking about, I think, counterterrorism. And ultimately, he said, "Look, I'm in trouble. My marriage is in shambles. I'm getting a divorce. I'm fighting a custody battle. I need $25,000," which, as you rightly point out, is not a big sum of money. But from that moment on, he had walked through a door he would never walk back the other way again, and he was their boy. And so ultimately, he was paid $300,000, which, as you rightly point out, is not a huge sum of money, but it certainly changed his lifestyle from a guy who was making, at that time between $70 and $80,000 a year. It changed his lifestyle in ways that made his life much more comfortable with his children. He was able to get full custody of his kids. And ultimately, I think money was it. But I think there was a little bit of disgruntlement with the U.S. government for what he perceived as not getting any help when he started to go through the divorce. The truth is, he could have gone through a couple of programs that the CIA holds open to employees who get into these sorts of financial and marital difficulties. The problem with that is that when you go to those groups, your chances of getting a foreign assignment where you could be recruited by a foreign intelligence service are greatly diminished. And I think Jim clearly knew that and kept it to himself. So I've never really fully understood why Jim felt that he couldn't go to the government for help, but then later could blame the government for not helping him more. Perhaps he thought they were clairvoyant. I don't know.
Or was he under the belief that he would be invincible and no one will be able to trace him?
I think Jim never walked into a room in his entire life where he did not think he was the brightest boy in the building. I mentioned that in the prologue of the book. He just has a natural belief in himself, and frankly, that's another one of those things that the CIA wants, is someone with supreme confidence. So much so that you can pass a polygraph with the right training and coaching. Yeah, I think Jim was again a very complicated guy who ultimately betraying his country seemed like a risk worth taking, and I think that he thought literally from the day he began to the day he was arrested that he would not be caught.
So what did Jim do? Do we have details? What kind of information he passed on? How did he pass it on?
Sure. He worked for a time at the Farm, which is the covert training center for the CIA, where all newly minted spies are trained. So while there, he was downloading some documents. The most damaging thing he did was he gave up the names of approximately 300 case officers. These are, newly minted folks, as I pointed out, who are going overseas for their first assignment. And he gave up their identities. And I don't think he gave up dossiers on them, but gave up their identities. And so that gave the Russian Federation the upper hand, so that they could follow these people around the world. And more devastating is that some of those spies were what they call NOCs, non-official cover spies. These are deep cover spies who are not posing as diplomats in the U.S. Embassy, for instance. They are people who are working as businessmen or businesswomen and or physicists or whatever. In overseas assignments. And so they don't have the sort of safety net that most of the CIA officers have who have diplomatic cover. If the foreign government catches a knock, that person can be executed or imprisoned for life or long periods of time. And so he gave up names of those people, and all of these people had to be called back from these foreign assignments, and it destroyed some careers, I'm told, and had a huge impact. He also gave up things like the name of the CIA station chief in Moscow and the names of what they call access agents. These are the people who are being recruited by CIA officers in Moscow and other spots. These people might be U.S. citizens, or maybe they're Czech citizens or whatever, but they're people who have insider information about the military, about the financial sector, that sort of thing, and so they can have information that's very useful to the United States. In this case, it was he was giving up information that was very useful to the Foreign Intelligence Service of Russia, which has always been considered, the United States' main enemy in terms of its ongoing spy wars.
Now, give us a little bit of, if you have an understanding of how the SVR operates within the United States and other countries around the world, and what kind of skills or capabilities that they have, that, and some of them, are they superior to us? Are they well organized? Are they better organized? Are they competing as well as Chinese maybe on the rise? Give us a little bit nuanced view, if you have, that how good these people are or not good.
I can tell you that the SVR spies are very, very good. They're probably as good as the CIA spies. They have different skills, but they have operated in the United States for a long time. The Russian consulate in San Francisco, which essentially overlooks the Silicon Valley, has always been known as a den of spies. They are active in that part of the world. They're active, of course, in Washington D.C. and in New York, especially, with the United Nations there. And so there is a huge presence of the SVR in the United States. Some of them are deep cover people, as you may recall from the book. There were roughly 10 or 12 illegals, as we call them, who are the deep cover Russians, were working here in the United States, including the rather lovely, sexy redhead Anna Chapman. They were all expelled from the country, and they were traded for 4 Western spies, 2 of whom came back to the United States. And one of those spies, I don't want to give too much away about the book because it's written on a narrative, but one of those spies ultimately is a key figure in the book. Let's just put it that way.
How did CIA get the sense that Jim was up to something and that was not good?
Well, they got a tip. They got a number of tips, but they got some tips from a particular Russian defector who was working for the United States. He had been a fairly high-ranking SVR officer. And this particular fellow gave some tips that narrowed a field of suspects. The FBI had to do sort of a matrix where they were developing things. As an example, this particular spy was able to point out some of the different places in Asia where Jim Nicholson had worked, and places that he had moved and things like that. And so by looking through the case files of the CIA officers and their various positions and the languages that they spoke, that was another of the little clues. They were able to identify 5 or 6, and ultimately from that they were able to cull it down to Jim Nicholson, who was ultimately the suspect. But that's what they call the predicate in these spy cases. The front end of these things, almost always, in fact, I would probably suggest always, there is a tip. They don't just go out and catch spies through good counterintelligence work. It's just not done. It's typically they get a tip and they act on it. Much like an investigative reporter like me, you get a tip about something and then you begin to do your research and you find out, oh, yep, that's true, or in most cases, no, it's not true.
Yes, and I guess eventually CIA involved FBI, and FBI had to set up a little bit of operation right where Jim was working, right in Virginia. And
it's one of the greatest things. There are 4 superlatives in this case. Jim is not only the highest-ranking CIA officer ever convicted of espionage, he's the only 2-time turncoat in U.S. history. He's the only one to pull it off from behind the bars of a prison in the United States. And for my tastes, the 4th superlative is the most interesting, and it's what holds the book and the story together in a very novelistic way. And that is, he's the only U.S. spy ever taken down in a literal spy versus spy operation, brother officer against brother officer, under the roof at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. So it's an extraordinary work, and that was all set up by the FBI, working closely with the CIA. And for once, the two agencies, who are rivals and don't care much for each other typically, worked very well together to bring Jim to justice.
Mm-hmm. Now, in this story, this is not only the betrayal of the nation, but it's also betrayal of the family as well. Nathan got involved, and that's why the name of the book is The Spire Son.
That's right. Right. Yeah, Nathan is an intriguing character all his own. For all of his dad's duplicity and deceit, Nathan is imbued with a kind of a naivete, a charming naivete, and he's you will find as you read the book, a very decent guy who was confronted with an extraordinary set of circumstances. His father had reached out to him and him alone to smuggle these messages out of the prison. I think Jim was well aware that neither his daughter Star or his oldest son Jeremy would do any such thing. But he knew that Nathan would, because Nathan was the most like him. They were both intelligent guys, charming guys, but for all of Jim's sort of guile, Nathan was completely guileless, and ultimately asked his father, is this illegal? And his father convinced him that it was not illegal. And of course, we know historically that that wasn't true.
Now, you would think that the father and son meeting together, a former spy who has been convicted, there will be some oversight in the prison system, that they would be recording his conversations or listening to him or keeping an eye on him. How did Jim manage to pass that information to Nathan in the prison?
Well, the two of them, Nathan and Jim, actually worked very well together as spies. Jim gave Nathan some training in tradecraft, and Nathan, equal to the task, came up with his own plans. For example, they had to exchange messages so that Nathan could carry messages out of the prison, but they knew they couldn't just be caught doing it. And so there are vending machines in the prison, and there are paper napkins. And so Nathan would come back with the food. They almost always ate jalapeno cheeseburgers and Coca-Colas. And they would sit there and talk the way the seating is in the prison visiting room, side by side, much like if you were sitting at an airport looking out the window at the planes. And so they'd be sitting together with the food between them, and Nathan would be able to see that his father had slipped a message underneath the sort of trash that was building up between them from the food wrappers and that sort of thing. And Nathan ultimately came up with the idea that his dad should write his messages to the Russians on those napkins. And so Jim would spend, hours in his cell at night, I think, writing these messages out on the napkins. And then ultimately, when he was ready to make the exchange, and Nathan was set for his next meeting with his Russian handlers, he would go and he would accept the napkin, but instead of taking the napkin in his hand or sticking it in his pocket right there, he would carry it to the trash receptacle in an area where the inmates cannot go, and would palm the message there. Or in a couple of cases, he actually dumped the trash and carried some of it with him into the bathroom, where he would take his shoe off and his sock off, and he would put the message underneath the ball of his foot. And that way, if he were stopped on the way out, which was very unlikely in a medium security prison, he would not be caught carrying these messages out. And Jim would have Nathan write some of the messages down, but Nathan at one point wrote them on his arm, and he was reading messages from the Russians to Jim, questions that the Russians were posing to Jim. And Jim, I think, was sort of aghast looking at the fact that his son had written these things on his arm. And he said, "Okay, now that I have the information, you really need to go wash your arm, please." And he did. So there was a lot of tradecraft that's really interesting. And there was some comical, darkly comical moments where Nathan's sister Star would come and show up for visits too. And at one point, she sat down and she was going to take the trash away with the message that Jim had worked hours on underneath the trash. And she started to pick it up, and Nathan had to make an excuse on the fly, saying, "Oh no, this is men's work. You have a seat and sit here and talk with Dad." And she said, "No, I'll take it." And an argument ensues, and ultimately he carries the trash off and palms the message. But there were a lot of moments like that, near misses, where they could have been caught. As for the security in the prison, it's a medium security prison, so there are contact visits in a visiting room that holds, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 people. And there's a lot of noise. There are, a select handful of corrections officers, guards who are watching over what these folks do. And, there's some surveillance cameras, but when the FBI did finally get onto these folks, they were unable to record in the prison visiting room. I'm giving a little bit about of the plot away here, but I will say that the FBI tried many, many different ways to record conversations with Jim and Nathan between the two of them. And there was some videotape that they were able to capture that showed them, sort of whispering to each other. Jim at one point holding up a piece of paper or a file folder in front of his mouth so that no one could read his lips. So they were they were practicing spy-like tradecraft throughout, and the FBI really had its hands full trying to catch these guys at it.
Is it legal for FBI to record the conversations of the inmates, or there are some legal issues involved, or there are no legal issues? Once you're convicted, there are no rights?
Well, it sort of depends on how you feel about Edward Snowden. So most of the attempted intercepts between Jim and Nathan, if not all of them, were conducted under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which, as you know, is controversial today because of some of the uses of it as they have been amended over the years. That has allowed for all the scooping up of all of our phone data, for instance, and its use against people in the war on terrorism. In their case, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act can be used on essentially three different kinds of cases, all of them national security. One of which is terrorism. Jim and Nathan were not terrorists. They were neither were they assassins, which is another type of person that the U.S. can go after. But they were in fact conducting espionage, and so they were ultimately the FBI was able to lay up on them surreptitiously and conduct surveillance. And they did an extraordinary amount of surveillance of Nathan and attempted to do some pretty good surveillance of them in the prison. But again, that wasn't very successful. But I mean, they followed Nathan all over the place. At one point, he is taking his sister on a murder mystery train trip in Central Oregon, out in what looks like the Wild West in Central Oregon, and an FBI agent and his wife had to just pose as an ordinary husband and wife and get on this train and to lay up on them. Meanwhile, they're checking his car. They're pouring through his car, and they're installing a GPS locator at one point, and these sorts of things. There's an extraordinary amount of sort of cat and mouse going on in the book.
Now, Jim, switching the topic a little bit here, Jim was very successful at what he was doing, and he was the lead trainer at the farm. And then he also had the opportunity to work in many countries, including Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, Hong Kong, Philippines, and of course Eastern Europe, Russia, and Romania as well. Did he develop a lot of context, or was there any oversight on him, or by the time they caught up with the system, it was a little bit too late, or?
Well, let me correct one thing. I don't think Jim was the head trainer. I think he was one of the sort of elite trainers at the farm there in Virginia. But Jim, over the years, I mean, his job was to develop assets, to develop people who could betray their countries or find ways for them to get information that would be helpful to the United States. It's an ongoing. Every country in the world does it. The United States is particularly adept at it, and frequently quite good at it. And sometimes there are some failures. Same with Russia. And their jobs are to either coerce or talk people into giving information to them. For, in many cases, large sums of money. Jim, on the other hand, decided to go the other way and betray his own country for that money. And that's a crime that is punishable by up to life imprisonment. And Jim getting 23 and a half years, a lot of people think that wasn't enough time.
Now, he got caught twice. So how did it happen first time, and then how did he manage to get access to the information, and then he got again second time?
Well, the first time he was arrested at Dulles Airport in a really cool operation. I don't want to describe in too much detail just because it's so exciting in the book. But there was at Dulles, they have these things called people movers, which move around. And this was back when you could walk right onto the tarmac to catch one of these puddle jumper airplanes. And he was going on a mission, a CIA mission with a couple of colleagues. He was heading to Switzerland, but his ultimate plan was to peel away and meet his Russian handler and give him a trove of documents that were on film. This was on, back when we had those little celluloid canisters, that came right out of the camera. as opposed to digital images. And he had photocopied at his desk over a period of weeks a whole lot of top secret and secret documents that he carried, that he was planning to carry away. And of course, he was carrying these things when he was caught. He was also, by the way, carrying the business card of his Swiss banker, Roland Keller, at the time of his arrest. Anyway, yeah, I don't want to give too much about, but I will tell you that there were many, many FBI agents in the arrest at Dulles, and it was November 16th of 1996. Yeah, I don't want to give too much away.
No, that's all right. We understand. What is the lesson for those who are in the making or training at or being trained at the farm?
Well, I think it's the same message for the folks at the farm as it would be at training facilities of the Russian Federation or of China or any other country in the world. Don't betray your countries because there are people out there, skilled people, who are really, really good at catching you at it, particularly if they get a small tip that they can work to the bone. And I guess the long lesson here is that no matter how good you think you are, no matter how crafty that you think you are, no matter how clever and intelligent you think you are, you can't match a team of dedicated people who are going to pull you under. Now, sometimes we don't know about the spies who haven't been caught, so maybe they were smarter than everybody else. But I will tell you that one of the cool scenes in the book is where Jim was doing what they call a dry cleaning in Singapore. He was walking the streets, looking in the windows to make sure that he was not being surveilled, that he was not being watched or tailed in any way. He was checking the cars that passed, checking the frequency of cars that looked familiar, and was walking into, at one point, walks into the underground train station and then springs back up and goes the other direction to throw off anybody who might be following him. But I will let one little part of it away. It's a very exciting scene in the book, but there was a big fight between the CIA and the FBI about whether or not they should put CIA officers on that surveillance team. And ultimately, they went with an extremely rare case where they used a foreign intelligence service. In this case, the Singaporeans actually did their own surveillance on behalf of the CIA, giving minute-by-minute accounts by phone. And they put a bunch of people following Jim, and they ultimately watched him step into a limousine with Russian diplomatic plates on it, which is, not very good tradecraft on Jim's part.
Mm-hmm. Now, did Jim ever realize, or was he aware of that he has become a suspect, that he has been targeted by his own country?
I think Jim never fully. I don't think he was ever fully cognizant that he was under investigation. But I think he had noticed the Russians had warned him, "Look, be careful if your computer starts to run slowly." And I think he had run into some of that. And just as a flash forward to that, I will tell you that one of the things that Jim was doing as he was coaching Nathan in spycraft was telling him, "Look, if your computer starts to run slowly, that may be a sign that you're under surveillance." And there were other signs as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, so first time he was caught at the Dulles airport. What happened the second time?
So the second time, he of course is incarcerated. He's in the federal prison in Sheridan, Oregon, and at that point, two FBI agents, one of them local here to Portland, and one who was actually on the original case against Jim, a leading counterintelligence official who had helped catch Jim in the first case. The two of them went in to have a chat with Jim, and boy, I don't want to give that scene away because that's one of the pivotal scenes toward the end of the first half of the book. But it's there's a really comical moment that involves a postcard from Cyprus, and I will leave it at that rather than give that away.
Fascinating. We've been talking with Bryan Denson, the author of Spire Son. Tell us a little bit more about yourself. How did you get interested in this book? What brought you into the world of writing? And how did your professional career develop in the last 10, 20 years?
Well, so I was a journalist, a daily newspaper journalist for pretty close to 34 years, from 1982 until last December 2015. And while I was in my final years at the paper, I worked episodically and for a while as a beat, a couple different times in the federal courthouse. And so in January of 2008, excuse me, January of 2009, I got a call from a contact of mine at the courthouse who said that I needed to be there that day during what they call mag court. It's the daily call of freshly arrested criminals, suspected criminals, who are brought in before a judge, a magistrate judge, to face their charges and plead guilty or not guilty, and move their cases along. And I was told that two guys were going to come in that I was going to be very interested in, and I got a little bit of a briefing ahead of time, and I had an idea what they were up to, and then later I got kind of a background briefing a little bit more, and I was able to write a pretty strong story on the case. I immediately got a call from a producer in Hollywood saying, "Are you going to write a long form piece about that?" And I said, "Absolutely. This is too interesting of a story to not." So I did write a sort of the haiku version of the book, and it was called "The Spy's Kid," and that was just really a story about the second case, not the first case, which I didn't know a whole lot about at the time. But yeah, I'd been a journalist for, like I say, 34 years. I'm still a journalist. I'm an investigator, but now I'm writing magazine pieces and more books. And so, have always wanted to write. I will say this: I am not the world's greatest investigative reporter. I'm also not the world's greatest literary writer, although I try to do both at a very high level. And when I can put the two together, I'm very effective. And in this case, my chops as an investigator and as a writer were able to shine through a bit because this was such an extraordinary story. One of those, maybe you get five of these kinds of stories in a career, and you're doing pretty well if you get five great stories like this in a career. And it was one of those things. I wasn't going to let go of it, and I worked very hard to find out every detail I could. I lived and breathed the story. So much so that I was doing what I call deep immersion reporting. I was to understand what it felt like, for instance, to be locked up in the county jail where Nathan Nicholson was. I was able to talk to some contacts of mine at the jail, and they let me ride from one jail to the other, just as Nathan Nicholson did, and they let me put on blue jail scrubs and belly chains and ankle chains and feel like a prisoner and smell and sort of there was I got to look at the food and the sack lunches, and so I could soak up all of these details and write them in a very cinematic way. And I think that's one of the reasons Hollywood's been so interested. The story has been optioned by Paramount Pictures. Robert De Niro and Shia LaBeouf have expressed interest in playing the father and the son. DJ Caruso wants to direct the film, and they hired a very, very top flight screenwriter, Carrie O. Salem, to write the screenplay. And now I think they're sitting around deciding when they will make the film.
Wow, what a wonderful outcome. Has CIA obviously learned some lessons from it in their recruitment policies, or have they made any changes that we are aware of, or has it been a learning experience, or it has been just another case that has been closed?
Whenever they roll up one of these cases, as they call these arrests, the CIA always does a debriefing of the spy, as they did with Nicholson, many days, one-on-one, answering questions with the tape running, a specific group of counterintelligence officials, FBI and CIA together, I think, at times. And they do learn, where they made their mistakes. But in this case, I don't think there's anything on the front end of this case that would have signaled that Jim was going to betray his country. In fact, quite the opposite. Jim was a real patriot, a true believer in the cause. He'd been in the U.S. Army, high-ranking military intelligence guy, and ultimately, it was only, 12 years into his tenure that things started to go south in his marriage. 12 years into his CIA tenure, and ultimately, I think that's when he began to think about betraying his country. And so it was a late moving deal. I don't think there's any way you can catch a spy like that who, there's a precipitating factor like a divorce or terrible money troubles.
So I would assume that Jim and Nathan are both in prison, federal prison right now, or?
Well, I don't want to give up. I will tell you that Jim got his prison sentence extended, and is now serving his time at the Supermax, in Florence, Colorado, which is where Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and Robert Hansen, the FBI's greatest betrayer, are serving their times. Hansen for espionage, Kaczynski for serial bombing that killed a number of people, and Ramzi Youssef, one of the World Trade Center bombers in the first case, was there and is there, and it's a rogues gallery of the worst in the federal system who are there. Nathan, I don't want to tell you where he is because it'll give away the ending of the book, and I would caution listeners to not go and start hunting stuff up on the internet, because it'll spoil the flow of the narrative, and I want them to read it like they were reading a spy novel, but understanding throughout that every line of the story was scrupulously verified and fact checked over and over until the layers of reporting really blend in and make it a truly exciting read. And of course, that's my opinion, but other people have expressed the same opinion. So,
well, thank you very much for your time and your comments. Fascinating book, reads so smooth and interesting, and it's a gripping non-fiction book that reads and engages like a fiction book.
Well, that was the intent, and I've been really pleased with the reviews and all of that, and I can't thank you for having me in for this interview.
You're welcome, and please do keep us in mind if you come up with another book or any other books on different topics. The audience at Rodara will always like to hear from you.
I can tell you that I just turned in yesterday my latest book proposal, and it's going to take me back in time about 25 years to one of the most violent spates of homicide in the United States, particularly to African American children and African American teenagers. I had written a series back in Houston called The Slaying of a Generation, and I'm going back and retracing some of the characters from that to tell a national story about where we've come in all those years.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.